We turn our attention to what is undoubtedly the most controversial and disputed of all the spiritual gifts. We're going to talk about prophecy. This, I think, is the gift that has become the focal point of debate among Christians who differ on whether all the gifts are operative today or not. My hope is that a careful analysis of what the New Testament says about prophecy will help diminish some of the heat and bring a little bit of unity among evangelical believers. So my approach will be to delineate several distinguishing characteristics of this spiritual gift. And it would appear that the place to begin is where the New Testament does on the day of Pentecost. We learn from the events described in Acts 2 that one of the primary characteristics of the Spirit's work in the last days, by the way, the last days refers to this entire age in which we live, is empowering people to prophesy. You remember Peter cited the words of Joel in the Old Testament, that in the last days, God said, I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my male servants and female servants, I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. Now, there's a whole lot to learn from the events of Pentecost, but our concern here is the way Peter described what is to be characteristic of the present church age. Now, as I just mentioned in passing, contrary to what many have been led to believe, the last days is not a reference to the final days or even years immediately preceding the second coming. The last days that Joel had in view when he uttered this prophecy back in the late 7th or early 6th century BC was the entire present age in which we now live between the two comings of Christ. The last days began on the day of Pentecost and extend all the way until Jesus returns. So the last days, this is the era of the new covenant, have now extended for nearly 2,000 years. And it is during this present church age that the Spirit will be poured out on all flesh, not just on kings and prophets and priests as it was in the Old Testament, but on every child of God, every man and woman, every son and daughter, young or old. So Peter's language in quoting Joel is unmistakable when it comes to this new covenant universalizing, if I can use that word, of the Spirit's empowering presence. Notice he said, verse 17, all flesh, irrespective of age, old men and young men, irrespective of gender. He talks about sons and daughters, male servants, female servants, irrespective of social rank. He talked about servants, irrespective of race, all flesh. In other words, both Jew and Gentile. Now, some have tried to argue that the events that occurred on Pentecost were designed solely, as it were, to launch or to inaugurate, or in some sense, jumpstart the age of the new covenant. Now, the coming of the Spirit and power in Pentecost most assuredly did inaugurate the new covenant. But what the Spirit did on that day centuries ago is also designed by God to characterize the experience of God's people throughout the course of this entire age until Jesus returns. In other words, what we're reading in Acts 2, verses 17 through 21, is a description of what the Holy Spirit does in and through and on behalf of God's people throughout the entire course of this present age. Prophecy, think about this, prophecy, whatever it may mean, is designed by God to be a normative experience for all God's people in this age in which we live as we await the return of the Lord.